There are people in this world who seem built differently, who carry themselves through life with a kind of grace that makes everything look easy. And when someone like that begins to show cracks, when the polish fades just enough for you to see the person underneath, it stops you. It makes you feel something you weren't quite prepared to feel. Catherine Zeta-Jones has been that kind of person for most of her adult life. Not just beautiful, though she was that in a way that made cameras fall in love with her. Not just talented, though she had more of it than most people ever get. She was magnetic in that rare, specific way that only a handful of people ever truly are. She walked onto a screen and the whole room leaned forward. She won an Oscar. She brought Broadway to its feet. She married one of the most iconic men Hollywood ever produced and somehow made the whole thing look natural, effortless, inevitable. For a long time, she seemed untouchable. Like someone who existed on a different level from the rest of us, above the noise, above the heartbreak, above the grinding reality that eventually catches up with everyone. But something has shifted. People who have loved her for decades are noticing it. Not all at once, not in a single moment that changed everything, but slowly, the way you notice a tide going out before you can quite explain what's different. A photograph here, an interview there. A long silence where there used to be brightness, and the fans who have been paying attention for years are no longer just admiring her. They're worried. She doesn't look like herself, something feels different, I really hope she's okay, those words are everywhere now. And the story behind them is so much deeper, so much more human, than most people have stopped to consider. To understand what's happening to Catherine Zeta-Jones today, you have to go back to the very beginning. Back before the red carpets and the Oscar statuette and the headlines. Back to a small industrial town in Wales called Swansea, where a girl grew up in a family of ordinary people with no particular reason to expect an extraordinary life. Her father worked at a sweet factory, her mother was a seamstress. The streets she grew up on were a long way from Hollywood in every sense that matters. And yet even then, something about her was different. There was an energy to her, a pull, a fire that people noticed without being able to explain it. She wasn't just a child who liked performing. She was a child who needed to, who came alive in front of an audience in a way that was already, even at that young age, undeniable. She started on small stages, local productions, talent shows. The kind of beginnings that most people never move beyond, but she moved beyond them, quickly. She made it to London, then to British television, then to the West End, and then, in the way that only happens for a very specific kind of talent, Hollywood came calling. And when it did, she didn't ease in quietly. She arrived like a force of nature. The Mask of Zorro introduced her to the world in 1998, and the world could not look away. She was physically extraordinary, yes, but it was never only about that. She had commitment, she had range. She had the kind of screen presence that can't be manufactured or learned, the kind you're either born with or you aren't. Then came Traffic. Then came Chicago, and with it, the performance that changed everything. Alongside Renee Zellweger and Richard Gere, in a film full of extraordinary performers, she was the one the audience couldn't stop watching. Her rendition of all that jazz didn't just play, it landed, it hit something. And when she stood on that stage at the Academy Awards in 2003 and accepted the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress, she was 33 years old and at the very peak of what a career can look like. Her personal life was writing its own story at the same time. Her relationship with Michael Douglas, a man 25 years older than her, had fascinated the world from the beginning. People were drawn to it and skeptical of it in equal measure. Some predicted it wouldn't last. Some called it a calculated move. But the two of them kept going, quietly and persistently, building something real together. They married in November of 2000. They had 2 children. And from the outside, looking in, it genuinely appeared that this woman had found a way to have everything. But nothing that looks perfect ever quite is. And behind the photographs, behind the headlines, behind the flawless image she carried into every public room, something more complicated was quietly taking shape. For most of the decade that followed, she lived the life that the world had decided belonged to her. The stunning actress, the devoted wife, the mother of 2. The woman who moved through glamour without being consumed by it. She and Michael built what appeared genuinely to be a strong and loving marriage. They traveled together, they showed up together. They spoke about their family with what sounded like real warmth rather than performed contentment. And her career kept moving, new films, new recognition, the steady accumulation of a legacy that most performers only dream about. She wore her success lightly. She didn't claw at it. She seemed, from everything she said and showed, to be at peace with the life she had made. But peace, for people living inside complicated lives, is rarely simple. Beneath the composed surface, beneath the graceful exterior, there were pressures accumulating that she never spoke about publicly. The real weight of raising children while sustaining a major career. The particular difficulty of being married to someone whose life came with its own storms, Michael Douglas, who had lived loudly and sometimes painfully, who had battled addiction and navigated health scares, and watched his own son Cameron descend into a spiral of legal trouble and eventually prison. These were not abstract difficulties. They were lived ones, the kind that settle into a marriage slowly and make demands on the people inside it that no one else can quite see. And Catherine carried them, quietly, steadily, with the same composure she had always shown the world. Those who worked alongside her in those years describe a woman who was warm in private and guarded in public, funny behind closed doors, controlled in front of cameras. Someone who understood that the image was part of the work, but who also had an interior life, rich and tender and protected, that she refused to let the world pick apart. What nobody on the outside fully understood was that something beneath that composed surface was already beginning to fracture. Slowly, the way things fracture before they break. And eventually she would speak about it herself, with a kind of honesty that no one expected, and that changed the way people understood her completely. In 2011, she did something quietly extraordinary, something that, in the landscape of celebrity culture at the time, was almost without precedent at her level. She told the truth. She came forward and disclosed that she had been diagnosed with bipolar II disorder. She had entered a treatment facility. She was seeking help actively and openly, and she was choosing to say so, not because a story was about to break, not because a publicist had advised her to get ahead of something, but because she believed, genuinely, that silence around mental health did more damage than it prevented. The world received this in complicated ways. There was admiration, real and widespread. There was support from people who recognized what it cost her to say it. But there was also the particular cruelty that follows any public figure who reveals something raw about themselves. The reduction, the speculation, the way a whole complex human being gets collapsed into a label and a headline, and a series of questions that no one really has the right to ask. What made her disclosure land with such weight was the context surrounding it. She came forward in the aftermath of Michael Douglas completing treatment for throat cancer, a battle that had been terrifying, grueling, and completely public. The man she loved had come close to the edge. And somewhere inside that long, frightening stretch of time, while she held everything together for her family, her own mental health had broken under the pressure in ways she could no longer manage alone. She had been the one carrying the weight for everyone else. She had been the steady one, the strong one, the one who didn't let things fall, and eventually something gave way. In the interviews that followed, she spoke about it with an openness that felt almost startling. She described what it looked like to push through long past the point where pushing through was working. To tell yourself you were fine so many times that you started to believe it even as everything underneath said otherwise. And she said that choosing to ask for help, really choosing it, not reluctantly accepting it, was the single hardest and most important thing she had ever done. People who had followed her career for years saw that moment as a turning point, not a collapse, a turn. A woman who had spent years performing strength for the world, finally choosing to be honest about what strength actually costs. And those who understood anything about mental health understood that it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, the kind you have to keep choosing every single day for the rest of your life. Mental health doesn't work like a wound you treat and move past. It stays with you. It changes shape. It asks things of you on days when you have nothing left to give. And the years that followed Catherine's disclosure made that truth very clear, both for her and for anyone paying attention. The complexity in her personal life didn't stop. In 2013, reports emerged that she and Michael Douglas had separated. The couple who had seemed so anchored to each other, who had survived cancer and public scrutiny, and the kind of family crisis that would crack most relationships entirely, appeared to be pulling apart. The details were murky, as they usually are when real relationships are reported on by people who don't know the people inside them. But the suggestion, carefully worded in most places, never fully confirmed, was that the weight of recent years had taken a toll that was difficult to come back from. They did come back from it. They reconciled, they kept going, and publicly they returned to looking like a partnership that had been tested and survived, but the way people watched her had changed. The pure admiration of the earlier years had softened into something more cautious, more attentive. Fans who loved her were no longer simply celebrating her. They were watching for something. Reading between lines, noticing what she said and more importantly what she no longer said. She would disappear from public life for stretches of time. Then reappear at a premiere at an event in a new project looking composed and professional and exactly as polished as ever. But there was something people noticed in those reappearances. Something quiet behind the eyes. The particular steadiness of a person who has been through something significant and is still, every day, carrying the weight of it, not broken by it. But marked by it permanently, her work continued, she showed up, she performed, she kept building. But something in the frequency had changed, and something in the conversation around her had changed too. Where people had once spoken about Catherine Zeta-Jones with pure admiration, they now spoke about her with something closer to tenderness. A protective kind of love. The kind you feel for someone who has let you see that they are, underneath everything, a real person in a real life with real limits. More recently, the conversation has grown louder. And more emotional. She remains present on social media, more so than many performers of her generation and stature. She shares moments from her life, her family, her humor, her beauty, her travels. And the response is still fundamentally warm. The love people feel for her has not disappeared. It runs deep, built over decades of real admiration for a real talent. But running underneath that warmth now is something else. A noticing, a worry that people struggle to put into words but feel clearly. Fans point to recent photographs and talk about how she looks different. They debate what that difference means, whether it's simply time, simply life, or something that points to a harder truth. Some of these conversations are kind, some are not, but within all of it, genuine concern keeps surfacing. Concern that is not about judgment. Concern that is simply about love and what love does when it gets frightened. Her marriage, which has now stretched across more than 25 years, continues to draw questions. Michael Douglas, now in his late 70s, has spoken openly in recent interviews about aging, about mortality, about the very different landscape of this stage of life. What that means for two people whose relationship has always been shaped in part by the distance in their ages. What it means now. When that distance becomes more visible in different ways, is something neither of them discusses publicly. They maintain the same privacy around their real life that they always have, but people wonder, because people who care tend to wonder, and there is the mental health reality which never goes away. She has spoken about it before. She continues to navigate it, according to those who know her, with genuine commitment to her own well-being. But living with bipolar II disorder is not a chapter of a story. It is the story running underneath everything else, requiring attention and management and resilience every single day. In the full and relentless glare of a spotlight that never completely turns off. The cumulative weight of that, the daily effort of it, over years and decades, is something most people who watch her from the outside cannot fully grasp. Those who have encountered her recently speak about a quality that is hard to name precisely. She is still present, still warm, still commands a room. But there is a stillness to her now that wasn't there in the same way before, a depth. The specific kind of depth that only comes from having lived through things, from having been changed by them, from having come out the other side not unscathed but still standing. And here is where it becomes worth asking the harder question, because the concern that fans feel for Catherine Zeta-Jones is genuine, but it is also, in part, a mirror. When we watch someone we have admired for a long time begin to look different, begin to age, to change, to show the evidence of a life that has not been without difficulty, we are not only seeing them. We are seeing ourselves. We see in them our own fears about time, about loss, about the way life marks us whether we consent to it or not. We see what it looks like when the distance between who we appear to be and what we are actually carrying becomes harder to maintain. Catherine Zeta-Jones has not given up. There is no evidence of that. She continues to work, to engage, to show up for the people in her life. She continues to speak in her quiet way about mental health, not loudly, not as a campaign, but as someone who simply refuses to pretend that her experience doesn't exist. That kind of quiet advocacy rarely gets the credit it deserves because it doesn't make noise, but it reaches people. It reaches the person watching alone at midnight who needs to know that someone like her has been where they are. The problem is that public attention is not designed to meet people where they actually are. It is designed to meet them where it expects them to be. And for a woman whose public identity was built around beauty, around glamour, around a kind of commanding, luminous perfection. Any deviation from that image gets interpreted as decline, as something wrong, as a reason to worry rather than simply a reason to understand. The more honest interpretation is simpler and harder and truer. She is a person who has lived through an enormous amount, who carries that living in ways that are beginning to show, and who is still, by any real measure, doing what most of us can only hope to do. Getting through it, choosing each day to keep going. She was never larger than life. That was something we decided about her. Underneath the Oscar and the headlines and the decades of public fascination, she has always simply been a woman from a small Welsh town who found her way to something extraordinary and has been trying to hold on to it in herself ever since. There is something that stays with you when you think about a life like hers, not the glamour of it, not the awards or the photographs or the moments that made the world stop. What stays with you is the quieter thing, the part underneath all of that. The part that kept going through cancer and crisis and mental illness and separation, and the grinding, unrelenting demands of being a public person with a private heart. She never asked to be a symbol, she asked to be an actress. The symbolism, the icon, the legend, the woman who seemed to have everything, that was something the world built around her, whether she asked for it or not. And she has lived inside that construction for decades, trying to be a real person within it. Trying to hold on to something true while the world projected its own needs and fantasies and fears onto her. What she has given through all of it is something genuinely rare. Not just the performances, though those were extraordinary. She gave honesty at a moment when honesty cost her something real. She stood up in an industry built on image and said, "I am not okay, I need help, and I am not ashamed of that." And in doing so, she reached people who were living their own quiet version of that same truth. People who had no Oscar and no camera pointed at them, but who recognized in her words something of their own experience. The fans leaving worried comments now are not wrong to care. Their care is real, and real care always matters, but care can also become its own kind of weight. And a woman who has spent so much of her life being watched, being assessed, being measured against the image she was once celebrated for, she deserves to exist somewhere beyond that. To be wherever she actually is, at whatever this stage of her life truly looks like, without the additional burden of an audience's expectations pressing down on her from every direction. She is in her mid-50s. She has raised 2 children into adulthood. She has stood beside a husband through a fight for his life. She has managed, with ongoing effort and ongoing courage, a mental health condition that does not get easier just because you've lived with it for a long time. She has kept a marriage alive across decades of change, across distance and difficulty, across the natural shifting that happens when 2 people grow older inside the same life together. These are not small things, not one of them is small. What is happening to Catherine Zeta-Jones right now may never resolve into a clean, satisfying narrative. Life rarely does. It may simply be what it looks like when a real woman in a real life moves through a real and difficult and ongoing chapter, without a script, without a safety net, and without the certainty that anything is going to get easier soon. But she is still here. That is not a small thing either. She is still choosing every day to show up, to engage, to keep being present in her own life even when that life is heavy. And perhaps in the end that is the truest and most human thing about her. Not the Oscar, not the glamour, not the years when everything she touched seemed to shine, just this, still here. Still standing, still in the quiet and private way of someone who has learned not to need an audience for it, fighting. For most of us that would be everything. For her it may simply be what each day requires, and she is meeting it the best way she knows how. If something about this story touched you, if it made you think about someone you love, or something you're carrying yourself, take a moment and share it in the comments. What does Catherine Zeta-Jones mean to you? What do you see when you look at her now, knowing what you know? And if you believe that people deserve to be seen fully, not just when they're shining, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories here. Stories told with care, with honesty, and with the weight they deserve. We'll be here when you are.